So this is about LGBTQI inclusivity in sport. And really, in my view, it's about the future of sport. And I've been interested anecdotally to see over the last 2 to 3 months, sports and clubs that have embraced change in terms of technology and reaching out to their members by like virtual AGMs and online tournaments. They'll be the sports that really include members and will grow. And while transgender and gender identity, which I'm talking about, is a much trickier issue, obviously, similar parallels will apply in terms of those sports and clubs that really embrace it will, in my view, grow because they're including more members and they're spreading a net of inclusivity that will resonate throughout the community. You might be sitting there thinking, why bother? It's not an issue in my club. It's a tiny percentage. It's a minefield. I'm going to let my NGB or an international body deal with the issue, and I'm going to just copy the guidelines, throw it up on the website, and hope it never comes to my door. And I empathise with that position because it is an incredibly tricky issue, and there's a lot of considerations. But what I'll say is, if it's a minefield for you, think about the trans athlete who's sitting in his or her room trying to work out a way to play the sport that he or she loves with the identity that he or she is comfortable with. And the second thing is that the studies show that the numbers of trans adults who identify as trans is essentially growing all the time. So 10 years ago it was roughly 0.3%, and that has now doubled to 0.6%. So it's growing. It's still a small percentage, but it's growing. And really the message is to embrace it. In terms of the legal history, it really goes back to probably the 70s when the first high-profile case of a trans athlete came to fore, which was Rennie Richards, who was born a man, highly talented athlete in school, wide receiver on the football team, good basketball player. Ultimately, tennis was the sport she chose in college, and in college she began transitioning to a woman. And ultimately, I think she was in her early 40s at the time, she entered the US Women's Tennis Open as a professional athlete, which prompted then the US Tennis Association to introduce mandatory gender screening. Now, Renee basically refused to undergo that screening, and as a result of that, she was banned from the tournament. She challenged that in the New York Supreme Court on the basis that it discriminated against her and that it violated human rights, and she won. So she eventually actually was able to play in that tournament, I think at the age of 42, and she got to the final of the doubles. The matter didn't really become as prominent again. The IOC introduced some guidelines in 2003 that were quite draconian, including eligibility requirements for competing in the Olympics that included a requirement to actually undergo surgery. That was when you're transitioning from male to female. And really the case that brought it to global attention again, in my view, was the case of Caster Semenya, which really kicked off in 2009. Caster Semenya is a black athlete from South Africa. She was born a woman, and kind of ironically in this sense, she was not a trans athlete. She had certain attributes that were alleged to be male attributes, and essentially she competed in the 2009 World Championships as a woman. I think she was 17. She won those, I think it was 800 meters, and instead of being able to celebrate that as a teenager, there were all sorts of questions flying around about her gender, which prompted the IAAF, which is the international governing body, to introduce an intersex test. They were supposed to do it on a confidential basis just for Caster Semenya herself. The results of those tests were leaked. That was incredibly embarrassing, humiliating. It resulted in the IAAF being branded racist, insensitive, and it was essentially kicked off a saga that rumbled on for 10 or so years. And ultimately in 2018, the IAAF introduced new guidelines essentially based on testosterone levels, which precluded Caster Semenya from competing as a woman. Effectively, they were telling Caster Semenya, even though you're born a woman, you're not a woman because your testosterone levels are above a certain level. She appealed that to CAS, the Court of Arbitration for Sport. She lost. She appealed it again, all the way up to the Swiss Supreme Court, and she lost there again. So ultimately, it's a very sad case. And in my view, it shows both that case and the Rennie Richards case really show that if you have a reactionary policy, it will end in a disaster. So it's the importance of having a proactive policy and giving it some serious thought about the sensitivities involved in the issue. So the call to action for sports clubs today really is to give this some thought. And I recognise how tricky an issue it is. There are some good policies out there, and there's some bad policies out there. I know, for example, that the US gymnastics still have a requirement that when you're transitioning from male to female, you undergo a gonadectomy, which is essentially a surgery which is considered now to be entirely draconian. There are some other good policies. There's a lot of considerations to take into account, but the real message is to be proactive about it. Some policies have considered things like age, at what age you can identify as either sex and what the cutoff is. So the RFU, for example, in rugby, have that age at 12, whereas British rowing have that age at 16. So these are all specific issues that will differ according to the sport, but the real issue is to balance inclusivity with safety and fair competition. And I'll end with a question for you, which is, if Johnny, who's age 16, comes to you tomorrow morning or next week or in a month and says, I identify now as a girl and I want to know how I can play the sport I love as a girl, or similarly, Lucy in the same fashion identifies as a guy and is asking those same questions, what are you going to say to them? Do you have a policy? If you don't have a policy, why not? If it's outdated, why is it outdated? And think about those things and get proactive and get inclusive. Thanks very much for watching this video, and we look forward to receiving your questions. Thank you.